Lecture 13. In the beginning, how to start a plot.
Getting a plot started is a scary prospect for many writers, but the reason it's scary varies from writer to writer. Some of us know so much about the story and characters even before we start that we can't decide where to begin. On the other hand, some of us only have a single episode or a single character, and we're not sure how to spin them into a complete narrative. In the first case, it can be hard to pick the right moment out of all the stuff in the story. And in the second case, it's hard to begin if you have no idea where the story is going to end up. Let's see if we can make this less scary. In The Art of Fiction, John Gardner says that a writer works out a plot in one of three ways: by borrowing some traditional plot or an action from real life, the method of the Greek tragedians, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, and many other writers, ancient and modern, by working his way back from the story's climax, or by groping his way forward from an initial situation. Let's take these one at a time. First, I want to make clear that borrowing a plot is not the same thing as plagiarism, though there have been instances when writers, even very famous ones, have copied ideas so slavishly that they came right up to the edge of, and sometimes over, what we call plagiarism today. Plagiarism generally involves passing off someone else's work as your own. Usually the plagiarist copies the original word for word, or very close to word for word. The kind of borrowing that Gardner is talking about is different. For one thing, it isn't disguised. If a writer bases a story or a novel on a Greek legend, for example, he or she is usually upfront about it. The proof is in the story itself for all to see. For another, most writers who borrow a plot usually change it in significant ways, or use it for a purpose that the original author may not have intended or even foreseen. For example, many writers have retold Homer's Odyssey. The most famous retelling is James Joyce's Ulysses, which uses the Odyssey as a roadmap for the comings and goings of two men in Dublin on one day in 1904. More recently, the Coen brothers used the story of the Odyssey to tell the comic story of three men who escaped from a southern chain gang during the Great Depression in their film, O Brother, Where Art Thou? In each case, the writers took Homer's story and did something new with it, or at least set it in a completely different context. But the debt that these two works owe to the original is clear. Nobody accuses Joyce or the Coen brothers of ripping off Homer. Many writers have done something similar with other great works of literature, telling a well-known or beloved story from a different point of view. Many of these works show us the original in a new light. John Gardner himself retold the story of Beowulf from the point of view of the monster in his novel Grendel. And a number of writers in recent years have reimagined famous stories through the lens of feminism. The American novelist Jane Smiley set Shakespeare's King Lear on an Iowa farm in her novel A Thousand Acres, suggesting that the reason two of Lear's three daughters reject him so badly is that he had sexually abused them when they were girls. In Wide Sargasso Sea, Jean Rhys imagines the backstory of Jane Eyre from the point of view of the first Mrs. Rochester, the famous mad woman in the attic. And Valerie Martin's novel, Mary Riley, retells Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from the point of view of a poor Irish servant who works in Dr. Jekyll's household. Other writers have had fun by putting a famous story in a new context. In his very clever novel Fangland, the novelist John Marks, who used to work as a producer at 60 Minutes, moves the story of Dracula from the late 19th century and sets it backstage at a TV news magazine in the present day. In each of these examples, the starting point for the writer is determined by the source material. John Marks begins Fangland, for example, with a young American journalist, recently engaged to be married, who is on her way to interview a mysterious Romanian businessman. This reproduces the opening of Dracula, in which a recently engaged English lawyer travels to visit a mysterious Transylvanian nobleman. Then, of course, there are historical novels that are based on the lives of famous people or on events in history. In these narratives, the story, if not the plot, is already laid out for the writer. And as with novels that adapt earlier works of literature, the most interesting historical novels reimagine the history in interesting ways. Robert Graves' novel I, Claudius and Marguerite Yourcenar's The Memoirs of Hadrian each tell the story of a famous Roman emperor from the emperor's point of view, giving us access to the private lives behind public events. John Banville's Dr. Copernicus is a fictionalized biography of the famous Polish astronomer. It tells the story of Copernicus in chronological order from his early childhood to his death, while giving us something only a novel can provide, namely access to Copernicus's most intimate thoughts. Other novelists have shown us famous people from the point of view of the less famous people around them. In his novel Quarantine, the British novelist Jim Crace reimagines Christ's 40 days in the wilderness from the points of view of several other people who were living in the Judean desert at the time. Sometimes, writers borrow types of plots rather than specific stories. Any beginning writer of mysteries or romance novels probably has a template for that sort of story in her head, whether she likes it or not. And while such a template can be a straitjacket, it can also be a convenient way to at least get a plot started, even if you plan to change it up later on. And sometimes writers borrow a plot not because they're particularly interested in the plot per se, but because they need a structure for what they are interested in. The science fiction writer William Gibson decided to structure his famous first novel, Neuromancer, as an old-fashioned noir thriller in the style of Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler. What he really wanted to do, however, was evoke a complex and colorful future and play with the cultural, social, and political implications of the computer revolution. So he used a thriller plot to provide a framework. Then he attached to it the stuff that really interested him. I did a similar thing with my first published novel, The Wild Colonial Boy. I wanted to write about political violence in Northern Ireland, so I modeled the book after the literary thrillers of writers I admired, including Joseph Conrad, Robert Stone, and John le Carré. And the last of the 3 novellas in my second book, Publish and Perish, is based explicitly on a famous and public domain horror story by the English writer M.R. James, Casting the Runes. James's story is one of the best horror stories ever written, and my version follows his plot pretty closely. But my version also plays what I hope are some interesting variations on the original, by changing the gender of the protagonist, setting it in Texas in the present day, and telling a lot more jokes than the original did. Gardner's next suggestion for getting a plot going is to start with the ending and structure the rest of the story so that it leads to that particular climax. Obviously, this method requires that you know how the story ends before you start writing. It probably works best if you're writing what I called a binary plot a couple of lectures ago. I'll be talking in much more detail about binary endings in the next lecture, but for now, suffice it to say that a binary narrative is one that has a yes or no or an either-or conclusion. The detective catches the murderer or he doesn't, the 2 lovers get together or they don't, or the main character experiences some sort of clear-cut victory or defeat. With a binary narrative, figuring out how to start by working backwards from the ending should be relatively easy. If there's a crime to be solved, you want to start with the crime or its immediate aftermath. If the climax requires the 2 lovers getting together, you need to start with their meeting or the situation that leads to their meeting. The rest of it is just working out the details. This is the method where you're most likely to find that an outline is useful. If you already know what happens at the end, that means you know what the plot needs to do to reach that point. You'll know which characters you'll need, what the setting will be, and roughly what steps the characters have to take to get there. I'm not much of a cook, but I imagine that working backwards from the ending is sort of like a chef tasting a dish and then reverse engineering the recipe to get that taste again. Of course, there are outlines and there are outlines. In my very first lecture, I suggested that a writer might sketch out his story by using the 5 W's of journalism and making a list of the various story elements. Who's in it, when it's set, where it's set, what happens, and why things happen. Making such a list in itself doesn't necessarily constitute an outline. It doesn't really tell you how to structure all these elements, but it certainly helps by cutting through the clutter and helping you focus on what's important. But sometimes a more formal outline can be very helpful. I've only used an outline myself once for my novel The Lecturer's Tale. This was the longest and most ambitious book I'd ever attempted up to that point in my career. It's a big, sprawling satire about an English department, with lots of characters who interact with each other in complicated ways. I didn't start with an outline, but about halfway through, I began to feel overwhelmed by everything I had to keep straight. So I took a few days off from actually writing the book and made a giant wall chart. This chart had all the major characters down one axis and all the chapters in the book along the other, and I graphed the movement of each character through the narrative. At first, making the chart was mostly an excuse not to work. I spent way too much time driving all over Austin, Texas, looking for just the right sketch pad and just the right set of colored markers. And then, after putting the chart up on the wall of my office, I quickly found it even more oppressive than trying to keep all the characters straight in my head, so I took it down. But in retrospect, the actual creation of the thing was enormously useful to me, and I'm not sure I ever would have made it to the end of the novel without it. On the other hand, I have more often written things using Gardner's third method of plotting, that is, starting with an image or a character or a situation and groping my way forward. You often hear writers talking about making a start without knowing where they're going. William Faulkner famously talked about how he started his great novel, The Sound and the Fury, with only a single image of a little girl with muddy underpants sitting in a tree, peering through a window at a funeral. If he was telling the truth, and nobody ever mythologized the life and career of William Faulkner the way William Faulkner did, then the fact that he started this way is especially impressive. From that simple beginning, The Sound and the Fury ended up as one of the most structurally complex novels in American literature. In fact, the novel may be complex because of this method, not in spite of it. The book has 4 major sections, told from various points of view. Each section is focused on a single day with flashbacks and flash-forwards. According to Faulkner, this structure was the direct result of trial and error. Here's what he had to say about it. I tried first to tell the story with one brother, and that wasn't enough. That was section 1. I tried it with another brother, and that wasn't enough. That was section 2. I tried the third brother because Caddy was still, to me, too beautiful and too moving to reduce her to telling what was going on, that it would be more passionate to see her through somebody else's eyes, I thought. And that failed, and I tried myself, the 4th section, to tell what happened, and I still failed. Of course, Faulkner's claim that he failed is more than a little disingenuous. What he calls failure turns out to be an incredibly productive way of constructing a complex novel. But it's important to point out that this method is certainly more time-consuming and, along the way, probably more frustrating than constructing an outline and sticking to it. One thing you learn pretty quickly as a writer is that writing fiction is not an efficient process, and that's as it should be. As the example of The Sound and the Fury shows us, most of the time you discover the good stuff by accident along the way. The methods of structuring a plot are not limited to simply 3, of course, as I'm sure even John Gardner would have admitted. You can certainly combine the 3 methods in interesting ways. Even if you're borrowing a plot, you may find yourself monkeying with it. And even if you're trying to stick to the facts of a famous life, such as the life of Hadrian or Copernicus, it's what you discover as you imagine yourself into that person's head that makes the narrative come alive. And it's certainly possible to know how a story ends and still grope your way forward from the beginning, which is how I wrote my novel Next. I knew 4 things about the story when I started: how it ended, where it was set, the fact that it took place in one day, and roughly who my main character was. Apart from that, I knew nothing about what happened between the opening scene and the climax of the book. And yet, even though I knew what the ending was, I still wrote the book as if I didn't. This effort was helped by the fact that the entire narrative is told from the point of view of Kevin, my main character, who of course has no idea either what's going to happen to him on that particular day. Much of the book is just Kevin walking around Austin, Texas in the heat of a summer's morning as he kills time before a job interview. As he walks, he takes stock of his life and remembers scenes from his past in flashback. I honestly had no idea what Kevin's history would turn out to be before I started, and I had only a rough idea of where he was going to walk. But I did have two advantages. I had a basic chronological structure to work with, a single day in Kevin's life, and I had the advantage that I was writing a book set in the town where I live. Each day, I simply rolled out of bed and walked the bit of Austin where Kevin was going to walk. I took note of everything and everyone I saw, and much of what I saw ended up in the novel. What surprised me as I wrote the book, however, was how much those sights and sounds in Kevin's present-day experience provoked ideas for Kevin's previous history. I never would have gotten these ideas if I just sat at my desk and tried to outline his backstory. For example, one of the biggest and most complex scenes in the book takes place in a chain supermarket called Gaia Market, which is my off-kilter version of Whole Foods. In this scene, Kevin stands in Gaia and witnesses a lover's argument. And as he listens to the young couple arguing, he remembers the time that he and his new girlfriend ran into his ex-girlfriend in the Gaia Market in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he lives. The juxtaposition of a present-day scene with a flashback in a similar setting ended up working really well. In fact, it became one of the key scenes in the book. And it didn't come from an outline. Instead, it was the direct result of me wandering into Whole Foods one morning. The main lesson here is that no matter how you decide to structure your plot, whether you outline it in every detail ahead of time or you just wing it, or you split the difference and do a little of both, you should be prepared to take advantage of happy accidents. Now, if you're still daunted by taking that first step, here are some ideas that may make it easier. First, remember that many stories begin in medias res, which is Latin for in the middle of things. In fact, it's tempting to say that all stories begin in medias res, because there's really no such thing as a story that begins ex nihilo, or from nothing. Even if you start a novel with the birth of the main character, the way Dickens starts David Copperfield, that character already has parents and relations, a family history, and a social and historical context. Or consider the opening line of Genesis, which is probably the least in medias res opening in history. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Even here, there is already a character in place, namely, God. What in medias res usually refers to, however, is starting the plot at a point where the story is already underway. Homer's Iliad starts in medias res. By the time the Iliad opens, the siege of Troy has already been going on for 10 years, and the present time narrative of the Iliad only depicts a few weeks near the end of the siege. Even though the story makes reference to how the war began and how it ends, the Iliad does not dramatize the kidnapping of Helen, which started the war, nor does it dramatize the fall of Troy, which ended it. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, the ghost of Hamlet's father appears in the first scene and tells Hamlet that he was murdered. This means the play has the same structure as a classic murder mystery, where half the story has already taken place by the time the body is found. More recent examples of in medias res include nearly every James Bond film, the opening scene of which usually shows 007 already fighting for his life. Another striking example is the opening scene of the television series Breaking Bad, which shows high school teacher turned meth cook Walter White wearing only his underpants and a gas mask, driving an RV frantically through the desert. This scene happens to be a flash forward. The rest of the episode backs up to show how his recent diagnosis of lung cancer has led him to cooking meth. When we consider the technique of in medias res, we see that choosing where to start a narrative is not necessarily about finding the chronological beginning of the story. Instead, it's about deciding what the most dramatically productive moment is. In other words, what's the beginning moment out of which you can get the most mileage as a storyteller? Shakespeare could have started Hamlet with the funeral of Hamlet's father, or with the marriage of Hamlet's mother to his uncle Polonius. Instead, he chose to open it with the moment that was most likely to make Hamlet reconsider recent events, namely the appearance of his father's vengeful ghost. And the opening of Breaking Bad hooks viewers immediately, making us want to know why this pudgy middle-aged guy is running around in the desert in his tighty-whities waving a gun. The opening of Breaking Bad does what an opening is supposed to do. It strongly suggests what the story is about, in this case middle-class, middle-aged desperation, but it does not explain everything. Yet another way to approach the start of a plot is to limit your choices. As I've said before, real life flows ceaselessly and infinitely in all directions. It's knowing what to leave out that turns life into fiction. You could limit your time frame, for example, have the story or novel take place in a single day, or a single week, or a single month. You could also limit the point of view, tell the story from the point of view of only one character. And if that doesn't work, the way it didn't work for Faulkner when he was writing The Sound and the Fury, you could introduce other points of view. You could use leapfrogging narrators, the way Faulkner does in one of his other novels, As I Lay Dying, or the way George R.R. Martin does in his Song of Ice and Fire series. But limiting the time frame doesn't necessarily mean you have to completely leave out other times in the characters' lives. This brings us back to in medias res. You can start the narrative at a particular moment and limit it to a particular time, the way Virginia Woolf limits Mrs. Dalloway to the events of one day. And yet, you could still range backwards and forwards in time and place, the way Mrs. Dalloway incorporates flashback scenes that take place years earlier in completely different settings. But what about that first line, that very first step? Here you have a lot of choices too, each one of which will both dictate and be dictated by what comes later. If you were telling a story from the point of view of a character who dies at the end, for example, you're going to be limited to a third-person narration, unless you want that character to narrate the story from beyond the grave, the way William Holden's character narrates the film Sunset Boulevard, or the way the murdered girl in Alice Sebold's The Lovely Bones narrates the story of her own death. If you're writing a story that features a surprise later on, one that the main character never sees coming, you might want to start in the first-person present tense or in the close third person. Using these points of view means that the reader lives in the moment right alongside the main character, seeing no more than she sees and knowing no more than she knows. As a result, the result is that the reader is just as surprised as the character is when the moment of surprise finally comes. Perhaps the best thing to do is to take a look at the openings of books and stories you admire. Take into account not just the immediate effect of that moment, but also how that opening prepares the reader for what comes later on. There are as many ways of doing this as there are writers, of course, but we can still group them into some useful categories. There are too many different ways to open a story for me to talk about them all, but here are some examples. One category, of course, is simply beginning at the beginning, the way Tolkien does in The Hobbit. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. This is a very fairy tale way to begin, of course. Even if Tolkien doesn't actually say it, there's an unspoken once upon a time at the beginning of that sentence. But as brief and to the point as it is, that simple 10-word sentence tells us right away that we're in a fantasy world inhabited by creatures called hobbits. It also tells us something important about hobbits, namely that they live underground, which, if you know Tolkien, you'll have to admit turns out to be surprisingly important. Large sections of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings take place underground. Another way to begin at the beginning is simply to state the premise of the story as bluntly as possible. Consider the first line of Franz Kafka's story, The Metamorphosis. One morning, upon awakening from agitated dreams, Gregor Samsa found himself in his bed transformed into a monstrous vermin. And by vermin, Kafka means a cockroach. In this particular translation, the opening sentence is only 19 words. But at the end of it, we know the name of the main character, we know that he is a man riddled with anxiety, and we know that he has undergone a horrific transformation. The rest of the story is essentially just working out all the implications of what it means for a man to be transformed overnight into a giant cockroach. Both of these openings are in the third person. But what if we begin at the beginning in the first person, with the narrator directly addressing the reader? I don't want to say that this is a uniquely American way of opening a novel. This is how David Copperfield begins, after all, as well as Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. But certainly many of the most famous American novels begin with the narrator speaking directly to the reader. Herman Melville's Moby Dick begins with "Call me Ishmael," and Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn begins with these famous sentences. "You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth mainly. There was things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth." In this case, the opening is not particularly dramatic, but it draws us in with one of the most distinctive voices in American literature, direct, humorous, and folksy. The opening of Huckleberry Finn also sets the tone of the novel. Whatever happens later, whether it's funny or desperate and profound, we know that we will hear about it from a character who is simultaneously lively and humane. The opening of another great American novel, Marilynne Robinson's Housekeeping, combines the directness of Melville with a straightforward summary of the important characters and the premise of the plot. My name is Ruth. I grew up with my younger sister Lucille under the care of my grandmother, Mrs. Sylvia Foster, and when she died, of her sisters-in-law, Mrs. Lily and Nona Foster, and when they fled, of her daughter, Mrs. Sylvia Fisher. The deceptive simplicity of this draws the reader in, but there is a lot packed in this sentence: orphan sisters, the death of a grandparent, abandonment. It also sets up the reader for the slow-motion surprise of the rest of the novel as Ruth and Lucille's final guardian, Sylvia, turns out to be one of the most eccentric characters in modern American fiction. Everything in that first sentence is true, but the working out of that situation, two little girls being cared for by a series of older relatives who either die, flee, or turn out to be strange, leads the reader into one of the most mysterious and complex experiences I've ever had as a reader. And it's the straightforward directness of Ruth's voice, her willingness to tell us everything, that keeps us engaged with the novel, no matter how weird and unsettling things get. As I keep saying in these lectures, writing is about imposing order on chaos, about making decisions. These decisions are often arbitrary ones, out of what seem to be an infinity of choices. Writing fiction is also as much about what you leave out as what you leave in. Your decision about when, where, and with whom to begin a narrative opens one path for you, even as it closes off a lot of others. And just like making decisions in real life, sometimes you don't realize what the consequences of your choices are until much, much later. But, unlike life, you can always go back and fix a bad decision, or even start over from scratch. Writing, and especially plotting, is not a science. It's an organic and wildly inefficient process of trial and error. But it's the stuff you don't plan for, the stuff that you don't see coming, the stuff that just presents itself, surprise, as you go along. That's the stuff that makes fiction worth reading and makes the writing of it simultaneously frustrating and rewarding. In the next and final lecture about plot, I'll talk about bringing a narrative to a conclusion, and I'll be focusing on 3 examples: Henry James's novella, The Aspern Papers, Flannery O'Connor's short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, and Catherine Mansfield's story, Miss Brill. In the meantime, here's an exercise to help you jumpstart the opening of a story. Imagine, at random and without thinking about it too much, some sort of striking or intriguing situation. For example, imagine a man and woman who are eating at a candlelit table in a romantic restaurant, but they aren't speaking to each other. In fact, they don't even look at each other. Or imagine a woman standing in an alley in the rain at night, holding a knife. Then again, without thinking about it too much, try imagining the very next thing that happens, and then the next, and then the next. If you find yourself running out of steam or boxing yourself into a corner, then go back to the original situation and try something completely different. I think you'll be surprised at how productive this can be.